Hello and welcome to Modern Populism and its Effect on Foreign Policy, a panel discussion marking the launch of the latest edition of the SAIS Review of International Affairs. I'm Nick Childress, Editor-in-Chief of the SAIS Review and moderator for today's discussion. The SAIS Review was founded in 1956 as an alumni letter including essays on contemporary issues in international relations. In 1981, the review became a full-fledged academic journal. Since 1984, the SAIS Review has been published under the auspices of the Foreign Policy Institute. The Foreign Policy Institute was founded by Paul Nitze as an institution within SAIS which would unite the worlds of scholarship and policy in order to search for realistic solutions to issues of international affairs. The SAIS Review shares this mission. We are dedicated to advancing the debate on international issues by combining scholarly research and practical experience. Some of our most notable authors have been Zbigniew Brzezinski, Madeleine Albright, George H.W. Bush, and Al Gore. Graduate students of SAIS from diverse backgrounds and concentrations have run the journal since 1981. In 2007, the SAIS Review ran its first populism issue. I dug up some old flyers promoting this event, and they had pictures of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Hugo Chavez, and Robert Mugabe. 10 years later, the images of populism have moved closer to home. Instead of Iran, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe, the countries which people think of when they think of populism are today the UK, France, Germany, and of course, the US. At the same time, Mugabe still runs Zimbabwe, and Hugo Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, has continued to lead Venezuela according to populist principles. So it is safe to say that populism is a strong force and is on the rise around the world. Today we're going to hear how to understand populism, where it came from, and what it means for foreign policy. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our guests here to discuss their articles on populism appearing in the SAIS Review. Cliff Young is the president of Ipsos Public Affairs in the United States. He also leads the Ipsos Global Election and Political Polling Risk Practice. His research specialties include social and public opinion trends, crisis management, corporate and institutional reputation, and election polling. He is an expert on polling in emerging markets, as well as adverse and hostile conditions. He has polled on over 100 elections around the world. He's also an adjunct professor here at SAIS and an instructor at Columbia University SIPA and University of Sao Paulo, where he teaches courses on public opinion and election forecasting. Cliff earned his BA from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and received both his MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. Jonathan Leslie is a third-year PhD candidate and graduate teaching assistant in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies. His research focuses on Iranian-Israeli relations, securitization, and the role of fear in politics. He has spent time living and studying in the Middle East, including in Jordan, Syria, and Israel. His blog, The Persian Blog of Kings, provides perspective and analysis on Iranian and Middle Eastern politics. He received his master's degree from SAIS, concentrating in strategic studies, and his bachelor's degree from Princeton University. Jennifer Fishkin-Kasner is the Chief Creative Officer of Golden's Glee and Chief Strategist of Kasner Media. She also serves on Manhattan's Community Board 5, on the boards of the American Jewish Committee Young Leaders Division Jewish-Muslim Alliance, and the Kehelas Atid of Chabad Bowery, as well as the Public Policy Committee for the United Jewish Appeal Federation of New York. Jennifer has also published pieces titled The Egyptian Uprising, The Difficulty of Making Change Stick, and Tunisia, The Role of Secularism. She received her MA in International Relations and International Economics here at SAIS, and her BS from Cornell University. All right, to start the conversation today. I'd like to start by asking each of you to summarize your article and tell us what the main arguments were. Dr. Young, would you like to start?
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's exciting. It's great to be here on a great panel as well. My colleague isn't here. I don't know if he's coming. Francisco Gonzalez, he and I wrote this article together. I think what I'll do is quickly just sort of describe the context behind the article, and then more specifically, the nuts and the bolts. As was announced here, mentioned here, I'm a professional pollster, worked a lot in politics and looking at public opinion and elections specifically. A big chunk of my experience, I spent 11 years in Brazil, polled all over Latin America, including Venezuela, including Bolivia, Morales and Maduro, Chavez. Saw Lula, Kirchner. I saw the whole host of what we'd call Latin American populists. And unbeknownst to me, I came back to the United States. I didn't think I was going to. I wasn't planning on it for personal reasons. We were going to spend a couple years here in the U.S. With my wife and my kids, and I ended up spending almost 10 years here now. And I ultimately covered elections here as well. And most fascinating of which, obviously, was the 2016 election. As we began that election, covering it, there were a lot of similarities between Trump and Trump supporters and what we had seen in Latin America. Very interesting sort of kernels here and there, same sort of belief systems, things that we saw in similar, and that shared a lot of characteristics in terms of belief systems and the sort of nomenclature employed. I thought was fascinating. Started having a lot of conversations with my colleague Francisco. He has a lot of experience in Latin America as well, discussing back and forth sort of the similarities between the Latin American experience when we say populism. I'll come back, because that's obviously a term that we need to define, and the U.S. experience, whatever it might be with Trump and the Trump phenomenon. Obviously, we can link to that, the phenomenon of Brexit and even some sort of events on the continent as well. But once again, seeing a lot of similarities across these places. And so our piece tries to sort of do some sort of conceptual and theoretical brush cleaning. We talk a lot about populism, both in academia as well as in practice. Us pollsters and pundits and politicos and the chattering class say populism a lot. And actually, to be quite frank, it means everything and nothing, right? And the question ultimately is, if I were to sit down with the client, and often I sit down with clients and we discuss given elections, given scenarios, we set the stage for them. We want them to understand what might happen. What are the conditions that might produce an event? We were thinking, well, so how would we define populism based upon our experiences across these different places? Ultimately, our article draws upon concrete data, a lot of polling data, both from Latin America, the United States, as well as globally, but also a lot of case studies, both historical. We go back all the way to the primordials of the Roman Republic. That's Francisco. He's a political theorist. But all the way to the present date, looking at different cases in different places. And very quickly, we define populism as a three-variable condition. A populist episode, and we try to stay away from the specifics of that it's not an ism, it's an outcome of three conditions that are interrelated and must happen all at the same time. The three are basically, first and foremost, you need to have a belief system that supports that sort of system, and I'll come back and I'll define that. You have to have public support. In the belief that the system is broken, or is what I call, or we call, the caudillo syndrome, and I'll come back to that in a second. So you need support for this thing, and I'll come back and define it. You actually need some sort of opportunity structure. It could be very acute, like an economic crisis. It could be more profound and prolonged, like cultural and social demographic change, like we're seeing in the United States, where we're seeing a changing socio-demographic population. It's causing sort of stresses on certain sort of in versus out groups and the redefinition of those things. And finally, you need a political entrepreneur. You need someone to take advantage of it. Populism, as we see it both in Latin America as well as the U.S. and Western cases. There's an individual, it's individualized, it's personified in an individual, but that that individual needs to take advantage of popular feeling on the one hand and the opportunity structure on the other. Unless you have the three sort of variables coalescing at one point, you don't have, you have strains of things that look like populism, but you don't have full-blown populist episodes as we can talk about in more detail what those are. The last point I was going to make, and I'll let it go. I know I've gone past my time already, but obviously, you gave me 10 minutes. We cut down to 5 because Francisco was here. Obviously, I took some sort of a royal royal prerogative, I guess. But ultimately, the point being is, I just want to reinforce the point on the belief system side. There needs to be a widespread belief that the system is broken. That it's a logic, it's a cultural logic like this. Our country is very rich. Why am I so poor and why am I disadvantaged? Oh, it's because the rich and the powerful have rigged the system against people like me. Oh, that resonates. You think of Trump, but you also see this all over Latin America and other places. Rigged the system against people like me. We need a strong leader to take the system back, even if he or she needs to break the rules. So the point being is you need these three variables: a political entrepreneur, the opportunity structure, whether it be economic or cultural, it's less important, and ultimately the belief system that reinforces this. This belief system is this caudillo logic, which I just described. We can talk more specifically what this means, but I'll hand it over to my panelists.
Mr. Leslie, would you like to?
Hey, great. Well, thank you. Thank you to Nick and to SAIS and the SAIS Review in particular for putting together this panel. I'm honored to be here today, both in my capacity as a panelist and with my fellow panelists, but also as an alumnus of SAIS and with one of my classmates, actually. We're the same year. So strong representation from the class of 2012 today. So when I set out to write this article for the SAIS Review approximately 6 months ago, populism was all the rage. Donald Trump had just been sworn in as president. Marine Le Pen was considered among the top contenders in the French presidential election. Theresa May had just triggered Article 50, marking the culmination of the Brexit process. Or I guess that will culminate when they actually leave, but starting that process. And academics and analysts alike were all beginning to focus their attention on populism and its effects and sort of the global wave of populism that was running throughout the United States and Europe and elsewhere. And that conversation focused on a lot of the places that Nick mentioned in his introduction, Great Britain, the United States, Europe. But Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, was not mentioned among this wave of populism, or at least not yet. But I sort of thought perhaps he should have been. And I'll just sort of digress from my article for a moment to say that, in the last 4 to 6 weeks, I think this has become more of a topic of conversation as Netanyahu's behavior begins to increasingly mimic or even outright copy Donald Trump's, his attacks on the media, the biased media and fake news, the attacks on the political left, and sort of the mounting scandals in his family's behavior, ironically enough. But I'm going to focus instead on what I originally thought about and what I originally wrote on, which was Netanyahu's foreign policy, and specifically how he's employed the tactics of populism in pursuit of that foreign policy. And first, I started from a place of how to define populism, because one of the problems, as I see it, and as the theorist whose theory on populism I eventually used saw it, was that it stems from the problem that the term itself is very vague, especially in its popular usage. It's applied to politicians on various ends of the political spectrum, think Trump and Sanders. Sometimes it's just referred to as something like a populist appeal, and a politician could tap into populist sentiment. Sometimes it's just a vague stand-in for appealing to the common people or sort of broad-based politics, which is kind of silly because that's generally what politics is meant to be. Getting a bit more specific, it often has an anti-elitist bent, as well as an emotional angle. So populists are angry, they're fed up, they're resentful. But this is not enough. It requires a better definition. So for that, I turned to the Princeton professor, Jan Werner Mueller, and his relatively recent book, What is Populism, for answers. So I'm going to employ three aspects of his theory in defining how Benjamin Netanyahu has used foreign populism in pursuit of his foreign policy. And these three are the moralistic imagination of politics, the fostering of a constant crisis or constant crisis atmosphere, and lastly, the selective application of law. So on the first point, on the moralistic imagination, Mueller defines populism as a exclusionary form of identity politics, in which there is one true people to the exclusion of all others. So in this conception, politics is not just a competition of ideas backed up by facts, but really it becomes about morality. Therefore, reality becomes much more flexible and subjective. There's the real people on one hand, and therefore anyone who's not supporting of the real people, who doesn't support the leader who claims to represent this real people, is logically not of the people and against them. You can see this conception at play in Netanyahu's foreign policy, specifically with his approach to Iran. When he speaks of Iran, it's often in terms of Iranian morality. He juxtaposes the idea of a humane and compassionate Israel, which is a force for good, with the forces of terror that Iran represents, who are steeped in blood. And these are Netanyahu terms used in his speeches. And to take it a step further, I mean, if you look at his reaction to the aftermath of the 2013 Iranian presidential election and the subsequent nuclear negotiations that took place under Hassan Rouhani, a large portion of the Israeli opposition to these negotiations and the agreement, and Rouhani in general, was based on moral concepts and the idea that Iran could not be trusted to keep its word, that they were deceitful, that they are liars, and frankly that they're pursuing their objectives of getting a bomb behind the backs of the credulous negotiators who agreed to this deal. So my second point is the constant crisis atmosphere. So politics is a performance. It requires drama, and this drama is fueled by crisis. But the key difference between understanding an ordinary crisis and the populist version is that the populist conflict is everlasting. The people must always, therefore, be vigilant and prepared for this conflict. And in fostering this atmosphere, populist leaders tend to use history as a weapon and to change history to fit their narrative needs. This is what the Yale historian Timothy Snyder calls the politics of eternity, which is a masquerade of history, concerned with the past, but in a very self-absorbed way, based on national victimhood and attack on the population by an external enemy. So for Netanyahu, there's plenty of examples for this. Broadly, he uses the Holocaust in a very politicized way. In Netanyahu's terms, the Jewish people live in a world that will never accept them, where the Holocaust is not necessarily a fact-based narrative, but a permanent state of being. Think of specific examples. His description of Purim, which again refers to Iran, becomes about a Persian Holocaust, which he refers to frequently in speeches around the time of the annual holiday. Or a couple years ago, his reference in a speech to the final solution as an originally Arab idea that was given to Hitler by the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. And my last point is the selective application of law. So this is discriminatory legalism, that there's only one true people that get full protection. So it's based on the maxim, for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law. This has become more obvious as Netanyahu has become embroiled in scandal, especially the last few weeks. But in foreign policy terms, this is relevant in a couple ways. Most obviously, there's the application of separate legal systems in Israel for Palestinians and Israelis. But also, more subtly, there's the use of the law to target political opposition based on their connection to foreign entities, to foreign infiltration. So there's recent legislative examples include loyalty oaths in the Knesset, which forced MKs to pledge allegiance to a Jewish, Zionist, and democratic state, where previously the oath was just to the state, or the targeting of left-wing NGOs via disclosure laws that force the left wing, specifically and left-wing NGOs, to disclose whether they're connected to European entities and European governments. So just to close, I'll recap my 3 points are that Netanyahu employs 3 aspects of Muir's populism: the moralistic imagination, the constant conflict, and selective application of law. And I just wrap up with one final thought. I actually had the chance to talk to Jan Werner Muir about 2 weeks ago, and as I was describing my article to him, he just reminded me that it's important to remember that populism has to ultimately refer back to the people and have some connection to the people. And I think, in Netanyahu's practice of it, it's about marshaling his people towards this constant conflict and creating an atmosphere where the security depends on the leader and depends on Netanyahu to keep his people safe from those who would be destroyers. So that's all I have, and thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kasner?
Hi, thank you for coming and thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I'm back at SAIS. I was a political theory or global theory and history concentrator, so my piece actually touches on that. So my piece seeks to answer the question of how the international system will be affected by the rise in populism. I explore populist and liberal organizing principles, analyze the causes of conflict and stability in the international system by using Charles Duran's power cycle theory for SAISers and Peter Katzenstein's understanding of the American imperium. And finally, by hypothesizing multiple outcomes, I assert that the rise in populism will have a deleterious effect on our current international order and, as a result, international stability. I assert in my piece that a populist framework for international order is fundamentally a realist order in international affairs. Thus, the liberal order would be destroyed. However, I assert that this does not need to come to pass for 2 main reasons. First, it is not accurate to state that the liberal international order does not have realist underpinnings. Second, if we analyze the international system from a bottom-up and top-down approach, in that we look at why so many people are disaffected with our system, but also analyze what the system looks like, we'll see that the globalized networked order that has emerged in the 21st century reflects a need to reorient how we understand the international system. Specifically, the importance of norms and networks, to accurately create policy that will reflect the underlying realities of the international system. As Anne-Marie Slaughter correctly states, in my mind, in How to Succeed in the Networked World, a Grand Strategy for the Digital Age, she says, in this world, problems and threats arise because people are too connected, not connected enough, or connected in the wrong ways to the wrong people or things. The essential fault line of the digital age is not between capitalism and communism, or democracy and autocracy, but between open and closed. An accurate representation of the norms needed to be popularized in this networked age will also serve to create stability, much like the promulgation of liberal norms in the post-Second World War context. A normative identity and grand strategy needs to be created for the American people that reflects the United States' role in the networked world, but that also takes into consideration the norms and values of those attracted to populist ideals, which I go into within my piece. The United States needs to create, through policy and public diplomacy, a reorientation to the connection side of human nature, and in so doing will combat the populist impulse. As Slaughter articulates, chess, or a realist framework, is competition. The desire to win is never in doubt. However, unlocking our caring side through networks reminds us of the enormous pleasure we take in connection to others. We no longer need to win, but we do need to be seen and recognized, to belong, to matter, to share, and to participate. Focusing on the caring side and asserting an American identity of connection would allow the United States to lead in the networked world, would accommodate multiple perspectives and viewpoints, while likely maintaining a more centrist opinion rather than a populist or extreme one, and could potentially be a pseudo-post-liberal identity that would be more globally appealing, as it would not necessitate a rejection of previously held narratives of self-identity.
Thank you. Now, I would like to ask a few follow-up questions to kick off the discussion, and then after that, we'll turn it over to the audience. So, Dr. Young, your article hinted that you may be working on more empirical studies to test your analytical framework, or that you plan to do so in the future. What kind of research would you conduct to test this framework, And are you conducting it, and if not, what kind of research would you like to see other people conduct?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. So we're doing a number of things. And so if you think, once again, going back to the article, our primary focus was this triangle, a three-variable, three-condition triangle for understanding populist episodes. All three have to coincide with each other at some sort of intensity. Let's define that at a different point. We have ongoing global polls on populism at Ipsos. We're doing it in more than 35 plus countries at this point, measuring what we are calling the Caldillo syndrome, this logic that I had defined and laid out. We're tracking that over time. And the extent that we can add countries that we otherwise haven't, we are. We want to see to what extent, at least on the public appeal or the belief system side, there's a widespread belief or support for a broken system and for individuals, extra-institutional actors to go in, break rules to take back the system or take back the country. But in addition, what we're doing as well, we're looking from sort of a clinical trials perspective. And we're starting to measure and create a database of populist episodes because along these three dimensions, we could think of country time over time. Let's start tracking these. So we're in the process of doing that with a series of research assistants and others helping us. Because what we ultimately want to do, because ultimately, and not to go into any sort of critique of other things that were written, not obviously in the journal, but out there in the broader world, what we want is a predictive model, right? And so on the one hand, tracking public appeal for this, belief system surrounding a broken system, like Caldillo syndrome. On those other two dimensions, the political entrepreneurial, we have to define it in a certain way. And on the opportunity structure, it could be acute and economic, like a exchange rate change, or it could be something long-term, socioeconomic. We're capturing that information over time for why? In order to develop predictive models. So that's what we're doing at this point.
Thank you. Mr. Leslie, the relationship between Netanyahu and Obama was notoriously bad, but the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump has been much warmer. As you wrote on your blog, Trump is Netanyahu's closest and most important international ally. Is the good relationship between Trump and Netanyahu because both men are populists, or is it just the latest iteration of the GOP establishment's longstanding pro-Israel position? And building on that, is an international political bloc or league of populist leaders in various countries possible?
Thanks for the question. It's really interesting. I think there's two parts to that. And first, I'm going to try to tackle the Netanyahu-Trump connection, and then I'll speak a little bit more broadly about the broader international bloc. It's true that Netanyahu and Trump are both populists, but I'm not necessarily sure that's the source of their friendship or their alliance. I mean, certainly it's strange. It's hard to sort of wrap your head around the last few weeks, as I said in my summary, that Netanyahu's become something of an Israeli Trump, just in the way he talks and the way he behaves. But I think in terms of the Republican-Israel connection, I mean, that's much longer, and that started back in 2008, and you can look at the 2012 election and see that Netanyahu was essentially openly supporting Romney at that point. It was a clear favoritism, and especially when you got into the negotiations about the nuclear deal, the invitation of it was Boehner, I think, who invited Netanyahu to address Congress behind Obama's back. I mean, this is just the same progression. I think if you approach Netanyahu with the usual cynicism that surrounds his political motivations, you can see Trump just as a man that will let Netanyahu do whatever he wants. He's not going to lecture him about settlements or the occupation. He'll give him the military aid that he seeks. May even move the embassy to Jerusalem, although I suppose that's on hold for the moment. But for Netanyahu, I mean, the biggest thing for him is the Iran deal and dismantling it and confronting Iran. And you can see that not only in his relationship with Trump, but also in Netanyahu's relationship with the Gulf Arab states and Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's more and more references in Israel to the moderate Arabs, meaning Saudi Arabia, which is sort of baffling to think about. But I think, Netanyahu is learning from Trump. I mean, he is learning how to behave as a populist leader. And like I said, I already talked about this, the biased media accusations, questioning the left. Even the use of social media has become a real tool for Netanyahu. Even a son who's involved in scandalous political problems and, are becoming more and more problematic for the father. I mean, that's true at this point. But I think, it's more a result of political circumstance than anything else for Netanyahu. But I think moving to the second part of the question, more broadly, I think on the international level, it's unlikely that you'll see any sort of permanent block between populous countries because by definition, they have to be separate to some extent. There was that sort of failed attempt at a conference between these right-wing leaders, but if you're defining populism in the way that Mueller does, I mean, it's based in the fact that one's people cannot be the other's people. So, Marine Le Pen's people can't be Donald Trump's people. They can't be the Brexit people. I mean, they're all somewhat separate. They can unite for temporary, issues of shared interest. Obviously, the EU and sort of this attack on globalism is one. The Iran deal works for Netanyahu and Trump specifically. But I think by definition, they're always going to be concerned first and foremost with their own people. So the goal for them is always to dismantle areas of international cooperation, not to create them. And I think whatever alliances do arise, they'll more or less be fleeting. And that's sort of the inevitable outcome of this internally focused worry about ourselves, us versus them formulation of populism that I think we're seeing today.
Thank you. Finally, Ms. Kastner, your article asserts that the best way for the U.S. to deal with populism is to change the norms which make up society, specifically that we should try to reorient the American identity to emphasize connection rather than division. Basically, this should co-opt the ability of ethnicity-based identity politics and nationalism to mobilize people against other Americans who are different. Currently, American identity politics are not based on connection, but division. It seems like every issue is polarizing. To name just one example, we are seeing a wave of clashes about monuments to Confederate figures. The media have split into two camps covering these events, which means that after each one of these clashes, people on both sides are driven further apart because the news they consume portrays the other side as unreasonable or even evil. So, is there any way to build connection across a political divide like this? And how can we keep media coverage from undermining any attempt to do so?
Sure. So before I delve into the heart of your question, I think I need to clarify a piece about my core thesis. Basically, the liberal project post-World War II was about creating a unified liberal normative structure for the United States or the Western world, and in so doing, we believed that we would spread peace because everyone would basically mold to this post-Enlightenment norm. What I'm arguing in a way is the opposite of that, in that that isn't working, and we see that on the extremes in both sides now, in that, if you look at Trump's populists, right, they see the cosmopolitan elite as fundamentally rejecting them as part of the United States or as American. And so I think when I talk about reorienting to connection, it's about recognizing that it's okay to have a different identity, and it's okay to associate with your ethnic identity. But what we need to do is figure out a way that we can formulate that while also having a core connection. So feeling like if you are a rural person in the middle of the country, someone in New York City actually cares about your interests, and we actually address the problems that we have. And so part of that in a way, and I'm deviating a little from my notes, but to a certain extent, what I'm arguing is the use of theory, right? So like if you correctly understand the issue, you can create real solutions. And I think that the monument crisis is a really interesting example of that. And the best way that I can explain theory the use of theory to people who don't believe in the use of theory potentially is the idea, right? If you had a heart condition, this is deviating, but, and we said, you know, we should treat it thinking about the four humors, we would all be like, what are you talking about? I need an EKG. And so in a way, what I'm saying is that we need an EKG for understanding the international system and using theory to assess it. So the monument debate is a really good example of that, because we're talking about popularly whether or not you should take away monuments around, you know, the Civil War. But the real issue isn't whether or not, and I have my own personal opinions about it, but whether or not the monuments themselves need to come down. The issue is what is driving those feelings. Why do people feel so disaffected and feel the need to assert Southern independence, or, you know, all of those different sentiments? And what are we saying about the ways in which we've reconstituted race relations, or we haven't, in this country? And so I think it's all a matter of will, personally. I mean, we talk a lot about how the media has been so divisive, and we spend a lot of time talking about how we don't agree and how, you know, we've created these two countries or two nations for two different Americas or more. But if we took all of that energy and we spent time thinking about creative solutions to try and think about how we can use tools to bring one another together and try and think about how we reconstitute in a networked world, in a 21st century approach, what the United States should really look like, I think we could find a solution. I mean, if you think about the capacity of human beings and what we've created, even the idea of creating the internet, how could we not find a solution to this problem if we actually decided to address it instead of just talking about how there's a problem? And so I think, you know, media, and I run a social media company, the first to say, you know, the power of it and the way in which it's been divisive. But it's just a tool. I mean, it's all about the people behind it. It's about the will behind it. It's about the ways in which we form partnerships to come up with creative solutions. So if you take a consulting approach to analyze what the problem is, how you come up with solutions, and how you create an America that creates dignity for every one of its citizens, then I think that there's no issue. You just have to decide to do it.
Thank you. At this time, I would like to start taking questions from the audience. So we have a microphone coming, so please wait for the microphone. And before you state your question, state your name and affiliation. If you're a SAIS student, give what year you are and what concentration.
Thank you. My name is Obad Ashtay. I'm Palestinian, and I work for One Voice Movement. My question is kind of probably to Mr. Leslie and also to Ms. Kastner, I guess. Can't see well from here. And it's regarding, you know, there's a rise and a fall for everything. So how do you see, so now let's suppose that country X, we have a rise of populism. What does the fall look like? And how does that affect generations that are living through this populism? And actually, I want to give an example from your paper, Netanyahu. So my analysis, for example, for Israel is that, you know, Netanyahu has been ruling since forever, and I believe that the leader impacted the public and their opinions, and now that's one of the main reasons why Israel is shifting right. So what happens to those generations that lived through this period of populism, and how do you see that ending? And my other question to Dr. Young is, you know, there are different types of populism, I guess, and in Venezuela, it's coupled with the aspects of dictatorship and so forth. Do you differentiate between, you know, a leader who uses manipulation, like in Israel, without being necessarily described as a dictator, as opposed to somebody who's a dictator and, you know, using everything to manipulate the public?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start. So yeah, I think you're right that, you know, Netanyahu has been a main driver of that rightward shift in Israel, and you can see that his message is clearly resonating in terms of he's been reelected despite numerous challenges, and each time predictions of his imminent demise. And he's done so mostly on a platform of security, and you know, he's made himself into Mr. Security. And my imagination of him as a populist is, you know, based off of the way he's employed that imagination of security. So I do think you're right in that it's a top-down phenomenon, and that he's sort of infected the public with this strain. Then again, I mean, you have to think that a lot of these predispositions were already there. He just sort of capitalized on them. What happens next? I mean, I'd be making more money than being a PhD candidate if I knew. But I think, I think the anger's there. I mean, he's fostered this atmosphere that I don't think can be undone in a minute. And it won't end if or when these corruption scandals do eventually catch up with him. This is not his first time around with these. And so the predictions you've seen in the last couple weeks with the possibility that he might resign, I don't believe it. But the question is, do you want what's next? I mean, who's the next prime minister after him? Is it Naftali Bennett? I mean, is it Ayelet Shaked? I mean, these aren't Avigdor Lieberman. Like, these aren't names that you want to be hearing associated with the Israeli premiership. But, I mean, it's been a constant shift to the right since 2009. And so I think that momentum has already been created. So I think, that next generation, there has to be some answer about how you undo this. And I think, Muir does offer some ideas. Whether they're applicable in Israel, I don't know. And I don't know if they've really been tested because we're still in the sort of main stages of this wave, and it hasn't come crashing down yet. So it's a long way of me saying I have no idea. But I don't know, maybe my fellow panelists will have a better sense of what could happen in a more broad sense.
So mine is maybe optimistic, but I think it's really important to know that you have a problem so that you can fix it. And I think, and I talk about this in my paper, which isn't a plug for the journal, but it's a little bit of plug for the journal. But these trends, which were discussed by other panelists, have been at play for a long time. And there's something that is fundamentally broken in our society. So, we're SAISers, so we talk about the importance of comparative advantage, we talk about the importance of trade, and we understand the benefits of automation. But fundamentally, there's a social contract that happens with that. And that hasn't been answered. We look at the benefits of globalization, but we haven't really analyzed what's the actual effect on the rest of the country. What happens when you automate? What happens to those people, and what is the responsibility of the government? And we're seeing people rising up against that. And we're seeing the ability for cybercrime. We're seeing all of these different phenomenons that happen as people are more connected. And so I personally think it's a good thing to be more connected. I think globalization is great. But there are negatives to it. And I think that this populist trend is exposing that. And hopefully it's doing it in such a way that we're all more awake to what's happening across the globe and within our country. And that means that we'll actually address those issues. Because I think people are nervous about what happens when populist leaders come to power. And in my mind, we're all sitting here talking about it, and we might not otherwise. And so hopefully, you take human capital and you say, there are all of these underlying issues. Now, how do we deal with it? Because what's happening is that people are upset and they feel a lack of dignity and they don't see a way forward, and that's not acceptable.
Yeah, and so just to answer your specific question, well, before that, I'll step back a bit, and I'll say that, I'm an eternal optimist, but I'm extremely pessimistic when it comes to long-term perspectives in terms of political outcomes, political policy and business outcomes. I think we're entering a new political super cycle of uncertainty, and these are being driven by long-term trends of social change that are caused by generational replacement, not people changing their attitudes or behaviors. There's a number of them. I don't want to go into all the detail. We can talk a little bit later about it. But the belief that the system is broken is a long-term 40, 50-year trend. In the Western world, I would include Israel as well. That's being driven by generational replacement. That is, younger populations coming into the population are more pessimistic less trustful than older ones. That creates, obviously, writ large, a governance problem and feeds into this caudillo syndrome, this notion of the aggrieved, at least a certain part specifically. But setting that aside, that larger statement, let me talk to you specifically about flavors of populism. Obviously, our paper went into this a bit. We didn't want to define everything. We weren't going to categorize everything. Obviously, populism could take on, populist episodes can take on. And when I think of populist episodes, I'm mostly thinking of electoral outcomes, whether the populist candidate party takes power or does very well at the voting booth. But you can think of populist episodes as being riots and uprisings and these sorts of things. The Arab Spring is a great example of, at the very least, the population itself, that one variable, public appeal, the belief system, the public reacting more specifically. But going back, populism or populist episodes can take on different flavors. In Latin America, it's of an economic nature, much more economic populism. It's the us versus them, the rich versus the poor. That's the us versus them, the Mueller us versus them, the in versus the out group. In Israel or in France, we see it at a very high level. Belgium now, some of the Central European countries. It's security populism. Indeed, we had security populism here, especially during the Noughts after 9/11, where civil liberties, people are willing to give up some civil liberties on the one hand to have more security on the other. In the United States, we can call it a lot of individuals are making the argument that it's economic. The economics are driving it, but indeed, I think that's there, but it probably explains about 20% of what we're seeing in the U.S. right now. It's actually about 80% is social demographic. We're seeing a rise of cultural populism. The Confederate flag, Robert E. Lee, as an example, 50% of the population think that you shouldn't take down a Robert E. Lee statue. The difference between Republicans and Democrats is something like 40. The point being is, there are different flavors of populist episodes, some economic, some cultural, some national security and orientation. But the point being, I think it's very important to emphasize, and actually my critique of Mueller is mostly looking at the strategies employed in some ways, not exclusively strategies employed by the political entrepreneur, and that's true us versus out group, a certain sense of grievance, it's symbolic in nature. But for populist episodes to occur, that is, to do well at the voting booth on election day, to bring out large masses to protest, you need these three contingent conditions to happen. You need the political entrepreneur that's clever, that can use these sort of strategies effectively from a political communications and a mobilization perspective. But you also need the opportunity structure. You need an acute economic problem, often that happens, or longer term, and especially what we're seeing in the Western world right now is longer term sort of social cultural change, both in the United States and Western Europe, the non-whitening of these populations, the non-Westernization of these populations. They're increasingly becoming different, more cosmopolitan, more pluralistic. That's a driver. And finally, we have the opportunity structure. It could be cultural long-term, it could be short or economic long-term, it could be short-term economic acute or some sort of other sort of national security issue. 9/11 could be an example of that. And finally, you need that public belief in a broken system that's central. And indeed, just going back to my initial point, this is why I believe we've entered a new normal. We're at all-time lows in terms of confidence in institutions, in terms of in interpersonal trust, which is important for a variety of reasons, both political and economic in nature. And these are being driven by generational replacement. That's sticky change. That's long-term change. As my grandma used to say, it's nothing that a good Christian burial, she was Christian, good Christian burial couldn't resolve, meaning old people are leaving the population with certain beliefs and attitudes, new ones are entering it, and this whole notion of a system is broken, the notion that I don't trust others is like maybe my grandparents did, that I don't trust those central institutions, is wholesale, especially in the Western world. Now, I don't want to overstate things because in emerging markets, especially with the growth we've seen, the rise of the middle class, we have a slightly different experience there. We have longer-term structural, kind of structural disbelief. The system is broken because the elites have always robbed us. They've always cheated us. That's always been kind of there. But especially in the Western world, we see this in a pronounced way. So along with an example, but I want to give a complete answer.
Is it on? Okay. Steve Winters, independent researcher and actually Johns Hopkins alum. So I think I addressed this to Cliff. Maybe you could clarify when you're talking about one of your conditions was a belief that the system is broken. But if I go over to the World Bank, for example, they'll give all sorts of indicators, for instance, quantitative measures of the disparity between the rich and the poor in a country and so forth and so on. Now they think those are objective measures. In fact, the claim is that if it goes beyond a certain threshold, that it's a sign of instability in the country, and statistically you're liable to have something happen probably. So obviously all sorts of efforts can be made to influence public opinion, but are you saying that it's all just a matter of belief, or are you saying that, or will you admit that there is an objective measure of systems being broken that has some input just aside from the perception of the same? And then just a real quick follow-on. And then this issue of, okay, that your third point was the feeling, okay, we need a strong, I better say person, to come in and straighten out the situation. Maybe somebody who's willing to break a few rules in the process. And think of the Philippines currently as a good example, maybe. But, of course, if you go back centuries, there probably in some historical writing, there was a great man theory. The whole idea was, yeah, that's wonderful. These great figures, Napoleon, who knows what. So, for example, just specifically, I would ask you, given the mess that Russia was in the wake of the Yeltsin era, can you imagine that country pulling itself together again without a strongman figure like Putin arising?
Okay, those are great questions. I guess they're directed to me. I guess I'll take them, right? You don't want to take them first, do you? No. On the first point about objective measures versus perceptions, obviously I deal in a world of perceptions. That is my world, not that there are objective factors there. I call that the opportunity structure. I think that we have to understand that, in essence, everyone's a little bit, excuse the language, a little bit pissed, a little bit angry, a little bit pessimistic. The question is that high in your priorities or low, right? And so I might kind of not like, I might be critical of the political class. They're not really delivering everything they promise. God, politicians, you hear this all over the world. Gosh, they never deliver what they promise. That's another politician talking again. And I was just in Brazil. I gave a speech in Brazil early last week, and the mayor of São Paulo, Doria, who's going to run for probably run for president, said, I'm not of politics. I'm working with politics. I mean, like this whole point of they're trying to take the fine line between sort of that's politicians, and I think people across the world, public opinion across the world, would agree with that. That's somewhat separate then from the opportunity structure, which are real economic conditions, real socio-demographic change. These things interact, and I wouldn't say that I have the cause and effect exactly the same, but they play off each other. In the short term, in practice, it's about prioritization, as I was saying before. So if things are going reasonably well, yeah, maybe I might be critical of the politicians, but they're delivering on the economy, they're delivering on healthcare, so I'm okay. It's a lower priority. We don't have to throw all the bums out. We don't have to blow up the system. But if I feel like things are not going well, like I'm being excluded, that I was the in-group and now I'm the out-group, I feel, and that's a true feeling in the U.S., I just might reprioritize things and say, yeah, you know what, blow up the whole system. So yes, you're right. There is a difference between objective indicators and subjective. And in our way, in our model, we're dividing those out between the belief system, the public, the beliefs that support the Caudillo syndrome, the system is broken, our beliefs themselves, and the opportunity structure are more concrete. On the second point, I'm not making a value judgment. And so I think a lot of the literature is trying to make some sort of value judgment about populist leaders, and we try to avoid that. Obviously, populist reactions, in some ways, you can think of them as corrective in nature. People are feeling aggrieved. People feel like government is not delivering in terms of their basic needs, et cetera. And ultimately, being value-free a bit and not making a value judgment about it, it's about the belief that the system is broken, that the present political class and government, state, is not delivering on people's basic needs. And we need someone that's going to go in there and break the rules to take back our country. Wow, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? That sounds like the U.S. But so, yes, in many ways, you can think of it as a corrective action to the system that's not delivering in the short or long term to people's basic needs. So hopefully I answered both your questions.
So it seems like you, Cliff, you like you say, you don't want to make a value judgment. Would any of the other two panelists
Oh, I always
like
wanna
to
make
make
value judgments,
well,
but just not about
you
that, yeah.
declined to make a value judgment, but
Yeah.
Jonathan or Jennifer, would you like
Could
to?
I just add,
Oh,
if
yeah,
I want to make
sure.
I will stand by my initial statement that, you know, for a variety of long-term trends, and some of these we've talked about here, we do see ourselves in a new normal where political policy and business outcomes first are increasingly fused together. They get confused, right? They used to be very separate in some ways in our heads, in people's heads. They're becoming they're kind of fused together and confused. And more importantly, that these outcomes are increasingly uncertain. So if you think about it from an election standpoint, man, we thought Trump wasn't going to win, but he won. Okay, we got that one wrong. But like, that's a perfect example. We thought Brexit was going to go one way, it went another way. We never thought that Nordstrom's or Uber would have to worry about politics in the way they have had to, but they did. And those are just some examples, but definitely we're in a world that has conditions such that create uncertain outcomes. And so that's as far as I'll go in terms of sort of my description.
But so, Jonathan or Jennifer, would you like to address the question of whether a country like Russia can move forward and progress without sort of a strongman type, populist type politician? So, in other words, does populism have any positive benefits that you can't get in another form of politics?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I'm not a Russian specialist, so I sort of hesitate to talk directly about Russia. But in terms of just values and its application to populism, I mean, it depends on how you're defining the term. The way I've used it in my work and the way Muir uses it, you know, it's inseparable from the idea of values and morality, and that's a key component of this version of populism. And you know, the figure at the top is claiming that moral authority. So yeah, I don't know if this applies to Russia. I suppose broadly you could say it might, but I think there is a value judgment to be made in that sense. I guess depending on what side of the spectrum you're on determines whether that's a good value or a bad value. I'll just add to the idea of speaking about a broken system. There's this belief that among certain people who want to see the system blown up, and at least there's a certain segment who want to see a system blown up to replace it with something, not necessarily, just anything. But there's another segment that's more reluctant to see that happen, but likes expressing the idea that they'll see the system blown up. And you hear that about the regretful Brexit voter, the regretful Trump voter. Just to reference another theorist that I talked about very briefly, Timothy Snyder talks about this a lot, the idea that there's a belief that the system can be disrupted without actually breaking, but it is possible for the system to break, and I'm not sure if everyone wants to see that. I don't know if that really addresses your question. That's just sort of a side point. But I hesitate to talk specifically about Putin in general, just because I read books about him on the side, but that's really not my area of specialty. Jennifer?
Yeah, I would echo that, and that I really am not a Russia specialist by any means, so I really couldn't answer that question. I do discuss in the American context in my piece that populism does not necessitate that the system will break. And also potentially that what we're currently experiencing is not populism by the normal means that we discuss. And I use Mead to define Jacksonianism and populism, and it's a whole other subject. But I don't think it's bad for people to have differing ideas about what would constitute the ideal system of government, because then you get natural checks and balances in the American context. And I think that that's important because I think that having that conversation and challenging our institutions to make them better is always a good thing. But that's a very American context answer. I couldn't really answer it in the Russian context.
Could I just add a little bit? I'm not.
Please.
Once again, I'm not an expert on Putin, but let's go there. So when you look at polling globally, when you look at the concept of broken system or a leader, I want a leader that breaks the institutional rules to take the country back. Russia is very, very high, and so if you were to rank order countries, Russia, among some others, are at the high end, and so there's this high predisposition towards populist-like populist-like entrepreneurs, versus a place even like the United States, which is lower. But you take a place like we've had our experience, but by the way, it was a plurality experience. It wasn't a majority experience. And I think it's important sort of to caveat that. But without a doubt, sort of Russia's at the high end. If you just look at sort of the belief systems or the items and the questions we use to capture that. Moreover, just sort of in terms of my own experience taking Latin America as well as Putin, and we're talking about foreign policy here. Many times foreign policy for these more populist-like leaders, let's use it, or populist-like entrepreneurs, is red meat to the base. And often, sort of, I see their foreign policy actions. And I'm thinking of Lula and his sort of South-South and their South-South sort of focus. I think of Kirchner in Argentina, South-South sort of focus. I think of Putin in terms of the sorts of things he's doing maybe on the Ukraine on one side, though there's some real security issues that they might have. But his involvement in other places where you wouldn't think otherwise they should be, given their size, et cetera. A lot of that, and maybe not all of it, but a lot of that is red meat to the base. Because the one thing we haven't talked about here in this whole sort of understanding of populism and the populism literature, there's a degree of question about whether final policy outcomes will be efficient and efficacious, right? At least in the Latin American sense, when you think of economic populism, you're thinking of heterodox economic policies that in the end never work out. They're illusory. They're an illusion to people. Maybe they talk to the base in the short term. They blame the sort of the rich, but ultimately longer term they don't sort of pan out. We're seeing that obviously in Venezuela today. There's this us versus them dynamic, throwing red meat to the base. Trump seems like he's always throwing red meat to the base, but when he's getting in a tough spot, he runs off to Ohio or St. Louis or Arizona and gives his speech to the base. That's a very classic example of this sort of dialogue and interaction. And one thing that we didn't talk about is this, Jonathan did a bit, this personal connection with the population. But I think from a foreign policy perspective, I often look at the foreign policy of more populist-like leaders, less the logic of the foreign policy itself, and much more as a domestic initiative to manage one's internal domestic constituency groups.
Okay, thank you. We'll take some more questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Albert Deal Global Associates. This question is directed primarily to Dr. Young. Are you gaining any confidence in your skills and abilities to predict how these trends will continue or what the causes are? In his book, David Goodhart talks about the road to somewhere. And as he goes back and traces the history, the logic makes sense as to why Brexit happened when Brexit happened. It has a UK focus, but nonetheless, it does have a parallel in other Western countries as well. So, so I'm not suggesting that we all want pollsters to always be 100% right, but do you feel like your industry or your trade or your specialization is going in the right direction?
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question, and we get it all the time. And what I would do here is separate out two sorts of predictions or scenario construction. So one is an election itself, something very specific, a point estimate. It's like predicting the exchange rate of the Brazilian real and the US dollar. That's an election. And what we're talking about here is much broader trends, longer term trends that are undeniable, They don't necessarily produce outcomes, and sometimes, when it comes to populist episodes, we don't even know when they might happen. Maybe if there's an election, we can kind of hone in on that. But when it comes to Arab Spring, when was that going to happen? There wasn't an institutionally sanctioned event like an election that would have predicted specifically what happened, though the conditions were there. So on the specific point estimate issue, what I would say is I'm a professional forecaster. Actually, big chunk of my career, big chunk of what I do is actually working with especially private sector, but government as well, to predict very finite, specific things like elections. And what I would say is best practice is never to use a single source. And so polls are awesome, but they're flawed. There are biases associated with them. And even if you take not just your poll, but you add them all together like Nate Silver does and take an average, that average can have bias, right? And so best practices for elections are the combination of multiple sources, polls and models and other sorts of things. And those sorts of models actually do fairly well. I mean, Brexit was basically, not just ours, but across the board, basically said 50-50. And in the U.S., it basically said 50-50. Now, for our clients, that's not a great place to be. If you're a hedge fund betting on currency or whatever, you want better odds than 50-50 because that's just 50-50, right? Maybe you play the upside or the downside or whatever. I would say the following. That said, I do think because of technological changes and the way humans interact through virtual space, that it's increasingly becoming difficult to conduct single input predictions, that is prediction just on polls, whether it be my poll or an average of polls. And like I was saying, best practices, you talk to any of the experts, including like a behavioral economists who have done a lot of work on this, multiple input from a variety of sources, taking the simple average probably does on average much better. And historically speaking, and even in recent past, these sorts of perspectives have done a much better job than just using single polls. So I feel comfortable that we have tools to be able to predict in a more accurate way, and these tools will not depend just on polls. That's the first thing. The second thing is in terms of constructing not something specific, but like coming up with a specific point estimate, but understanding a broad trends and scenarios, all we can talk about is in generalities, right? And so we think the propensity is greater for more populist episodes, but obviously there's a lot more factors than just three that ultimately go into predicting things. So what we do ultimately is try to rank order scenarios. And so we can't tell you if necessarily that a given populist episode will happen, but what we want to do is give you a reasonable idea whether it's high, medium, low. And so for the most part, I would say, and most of what we do when we talk about long-term, broad scenario construction, it's just saying something has a greater likelihood, a high likelihood, or a low likelihood. I think we have a very, we have a clarity in terms of the trends and sort of the downside of these trends. And I use one of them being low levels of trust. We know there's a variety of consequences of that. Can we input some sort of technological change or something else that might change the way things are? No. But I think at least in the short term, if we think of short-term prediction over the next 10 years, at least a big chunk of the rest of my professional life, the next 15, 20 years or so, I think we have a pretty good idea where the long-term trends are. And long-term trends, at the very least, nothing more, are suggesting that governance increasingly will be difficult. And there's a variety of ways those things, there's a variety of paths, lower levels of government and difficulty that the governments can take. So I think from the prediction standpoint, specific elections, let's use a whole bunch of different sort of methods, combine them together. That's best practices anyways. We shouldn't only use polls. You shouldn't only look at polls. From long-term scenario construction, there's a lot more question marks. That's why we should only triage in some ways about possible scenarios.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for one last question from the audience. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you. So, just quick question. Nobody talks about Erdogan and the Turkish Erdogan in populism. Like, can you talk about him a little bit and like how he fits within this? And also, you mentioned shades of populism. Like, where do you think he fits within those shades?
Yeah, I'll try.
I mean, I'm talking a lot here.
No, I'll try. I mean, I think, yeah, it's certainly a case that could be reasonably classified as a populist, scenario. From my perspective, again, employing the same sort of rubric I've been using this whole time, I mean, there's certainly a moral aspect at play to Erdogan's rise and, and grip on authority. And I think, there's also an element, I mean, especially now, post-coup, you can apply the constant crisis mold as well. I mean, I don't know if that's, you can believe the conspiracy theorists on this, or not, whether that's self-engineered or not, or whether it's just taking advantage of the situation, tough to say. But yeah, I mean, the demonization of sort of the outside enemy is real for him, and especially with regards to Kurds, and in neighboring countries, like Syria. So I think it's tough. I mean, I'd have to understand a bit more about internal Turkish politics to reasonably make an accusation. But I mean, I think the broader swaths of it are there. But a lot is, how the leader relates to his people. And I think, for Erdogan, like that's definitely the source of his authority. And it's it's creating this connection to the real Turkish people and, who those are. And it's that element in particular that really matters. The idea that there's a real set of people, and that if you're outside of that, you're not an Erdogan supporter, by definition, you're not of the real Turkish people. And so I think that's the element of populism that I really seize on, and I think, I think there's a strong case to be made that he fits within this mold as well.
And I'd like to say, at least one article in this issue of the SAIS review talks about Erdogan, so I hope that you will pick it up when it comes out. It should be out in about 3 to 4 weeks. And with that, I would like to say thank you all for coming. And thank you to our 3 panelists for speaking today. It was very informative. And I'd also like to thank our staff of assistant editors, which are all graduate students of SAIS, for their work put into the issue. And finally, I'd like to thank our advisory board, and especially our faculty advisor, Dr. Carla Freeman, who is also the director of the Foreign Policy Institute. And now I hope you all join us for a reception in the next room over, and we can continue the discussion in a more informal setting. Thank you.